Welcome to the debate. Our focus today stems from a really powerful and frankly deeply unsettling analysis of the modern financial landscape. We're looking specifically at assertions made by Devin McClarty in the work Building Wealth Beyond Social Security, which is published by D Publishing Group. And this material, it offers more than just a critique. It really presents a mandate for a complete shift in personal finance strategy.
Right.
So the central question we need to tackle is this. Does the well-documented structural obsolescence of the U.S. Social Security system necessitate its absolute rejection? And crucially, does it require building these proprietary, individualized financial engines based exclusively on asset ownership and licensed intellectual property?
Okay.
So I'll be arguing the core thesis that the system is structurally obsolete, fundamentally broken, and that proactive ownership creation, building your own engine, is really the only viable response left.
And I will be coming at this from a slightly different angle. I want to challenge the fundamental premise that this really radical, highly specific proprietary approach is, well, necessary or even feasible as a universal replacement strategy for the vast majority of the modern workforce. I mean, while McClarty provides an irrefutably sharp assessment of the system's flaws, no argument there, mandating that every single individual becomes some kind of IP licensing enterprise, perhaps controlled by an entity like D Investment Enterprise, that, in my view, demands too high a barrier to entry for most people.
Okay. Well, my position is really rooted in the mathematical reality of the system itself. The material defines Social Security as a disappearing illusion. It calls it a rigged equation based on an outdated model. And that model, it was designed for a 20th century career path, right? 35-plus years of singular, consistent employment. That world, well, it's simply vanished.
Mm-hmm.
The core flaw is baked into the calculation. The formula averages your 35 highest earning years. Now, for the modern worker, I'm talking about people navigating career breaks, maybe extended education, the gig economy, or even just late entry into the primary workforce, maybe starting at 25 or 27. They inherently lose 5, maybe 10 potential high-earning years right off the bat. These gaps, these low-earning periods, they get entered as zero-value years. And the structural penalty from those zeros is enormous because they're mathematically stacked against the individual. It basically guarantees they will never achieve the, quote, mythical full benefit. The system is designed for an ideal consistency that modern reality just refuses to provide. So the only logical path, as I see it, is to stop chasing retirement and actually start building ownership.
The author makes this point pretty starkly by contrasting 35 years of waiting versus 3 years of building an independent cash flow engine.
Okay. Look, I fully agree that the critique of the 35-year average calculation is devastating. It absolutely renders the system deeply penalizing for precisely the demographic that, let's face it, makes up the bulk of the modern flexible workforce today. No question.
Right.
However, where I diverge is the conclusion that the resulting benefit is therefore entirely worthless crumbs that must be abandoned immediately. The critique focuses quite effectively on the structural flaw, but the solution then pivots to a very specific, almost high-level entrepreneurial framework. I mean, the proposed alternative, developing these proprietary engines through trademarked names, licensing intellectual property, creating vaults and digital assets, using sophisticated tax loops. This requires a pretty unique set of skills, doesn't it? Not to mention legal infrastructure and likely significant upfront capitalization.
Well,
it effectively demands that the individual not only address the government's failure, but also become essentially an asset creation and licensing business themselves. And for the millions penalized by those career gaps we just talked about, mandating that they create bespoke, monetized intellectual property as their sole replacement strategy, well, it just doesn't seem universally practical. The sensible response, I believe, is probably financial planning that accounts for the guaranteed reduction in benefits, rather than mandating this highly specialized ownership strategy reliant on IP monetization as the only countermeasure.
I see why you'd think that, but let me offer maybe a different perspective on the calculation versus the actual consequence. Let's focus on the mathematics of the injustice here. which is really our first point of contention. You suggest planning around the reduced outcome. Okay. I argue that because the formula guarantees a reduced and often insufficient outcome for anyone who doesn't meet that obsolete 35-year ideal, the system is fundamentally unfair at its core.
Mm-hmm.
A benefit that requires, 35 years of commitment, yet is guaranteed to be financially insufficient for a modern life, isn't that functionally equivalent to worthlessness? Why spend decades contributing to a system that explicitly penalizes the reality of your career path?
Okay, I agree. The penalty is severe, and it's mathematically inscribed. I get that. But we do need to distinguish, I think, between a system that's reduced in its payout and a system that's a complete disappearing illusion. Even a reduced benefit offers a crucial baseline safety net, something non-correlated with the market risks that are just inherent in running your own proprietary business. It represents a guaranteed floor, however low.
A very low floor.
Perhaps. But my concern is that your solution, the proprietary financial engine, is a highly specific answer to what is actually a generalized problem. Is the required intellectual lift, the financial lift, of building your own engine, including, creating and legally defending proprietary systems like the ones mentioned in the material, things like LoopSpeak or LoopCourt, is that really necessary for everyone? Or is it perhaps only truly viable for those who already have the capital and the specialized knowledge to monetize sophisticated intangible assets? For many, I suspect the hurdle of creating licensed audiovisual IP is far, far greater than the value derived from that guaranteed, albeit minimal, safety net.
But I think that line of reasoning overlooks the core principle here. The proprietary examples given, like LoopSpeak, they're simply vehicles for what is actually a universally applicable philosophy, which I think leads us neatly into our second and maybe the most critical contention, the universal applicability of this ownership strategy and, what exactly these engines are really supposed to be.
Okay.
You correctly point out that the author's personal implementation involves trademark names, IP licensing, and these vaults. But the concept of the engine is the proactive shift. It's moving from being a passive consumer of some promised future benefit to being the active owner of an immediate cash-flowing asset. The scale initially doesn't matter as much as the control does.
Okay, then help me generalize the concept, because the material does lean heavily on very specific terms like vaults and digital assets and these tax loops without maybe fully defining the core function for, say, the average listener. If we move past the specific branding like the DPG Network Vault, what is the fundamental blueprint for this engine that makes it universally applicable, as you say?
Right. The engine is fundamentally about leveraging intangible assets. It's about creating proprietary systems that could be processes, specialized information, unique media content, and then monetizing them, often through licensing, to generate predictable cash flow. Crucially, this is often done through a corporate structure, like the mentioned D Investment Enterprise LLC, which then allows for more advanced financial strategies.
Such as
the tax loops. When the material discusses tax loops, it's primarily referring to the strategic use of corporate provisions, specifically the amortization of intellectual property. Unlike, say, a tangible asset, like a building, proprietary IP can often be amortized over many years. This creates significant tax deductions that can offset the cash flow income generated by the IP. It's a mechanism for retaining capital and maximizing cash flow now, rather than waiting decades for a government payment that's likely to be reduced anyway. So this framework, asset creation, IP amortization, structured cash flow, that's what allows someone potentially to build definitive wealth in, say, 3 years, as opposed to decades of waiting.
Okay, that is a much clearer definition, thank you. And I will concede that the use of IP amortization within a corporate structure is a powerful and perhaps more generalizable mechanism for accelerated wealth building than just focusing on the specific grants mentioned. However, even if the philosophical shift is universal, the execution still seems to require a significant threshold of intellectual and financial capital. You are essentially mandating that everyone transition from being perhaps an employee to being a pretty sophisticated business owner, complete with ongoing legal and accounting overhead. That's a big leap.
The alternative, though, is guaranteed financial subordination to an obsolete system. The ownership strategy can start small. It might begin with refining debt structures, generating initial cash flow through smart asset acquisition, maximizing things like cashback rewards. The key is the mindset shift to ownership first. You seize independent control, you create financial flow immediately, regardless of the initial scale. The choice is really defined by that contrast, the potential 3-year outcome versus the uncertain 35-year promise.
Okay, well, that takes us directly to our third contention then. Ownership, risk versus the safety net value. You highlight the definitive nature of ownership potentially built in 3 years, and you quote the assertion that Social Security was never meant for us, but engines were.
Exactly.
But I challenge the stability of that ownership. While the guaranteed, albeit reduced, baseline of Social Security is non-volatile, in a market sense it's not tied to stock fluctuations day to day, the income generated from licensing proprietary assets, even when managed under a structure like D Investment Enterprise LLC, is inherently exposed to market risks, technological obsolescence, and significant legal risks. IP has to be continually maintained, it has to be defended against infringement, and its ultimate value is completely contingent on market demand for whatever the licensed product is, whether that's audiovisual IP like LoopCourt TEM or some patented process. That's not exactly risk-free.
The risk is a known quantity, though. It's managed internally. The risk profile of a proprietary engine is, or should be, transparent, measurable, and adaptable by the owner. If a particular licensed asset starts to decline, you pivot, you update it, or you create a new one. That is control. Contrast that with the volatility of government policy and, more importantly, the structural guarantee that the 35-year formula already ensures a reduced benefit for so many. I would choose the market and entrepreneurial risks that are under my control over the guaranteed structural penalty and the opaque policy risk administered by an external, clearly obsolete institutional system. The author built definitive, controllable assets in 3 years. That's the point.
But the risk extends beyond just market acceptance, doesn't it? Consider regulatory risk. The very power of the tax loops you described earlier, the amortization of IP, the strategic use of corporate structures, that power is highly susceptible to legislative changes. A guaranteed minimal benefit from Social Security, while likely insufficient on its own, does provide some insulation against the day a new administration decides to close those specific corporate tax advantages. The proprietary engine model, particularly when it's leveraged heavily for tax efficiency, seems far more exposed to changes in the tax code than that basic safety net component.
And that is precisely why the structure is built on ownership. Real assets, tangible and intangible, which inherently survives policy changes better than a mere promise of a future payment. The institutional system, Social Security, is designed to extract contributions based on an outdated formula, and is, as you admit, politically volatile. The engine, on the other hand, is designed for immediate, controlled cash flow, mitigating the necessity of that external promise entirely.
Okay. In conclusion, then, let me summarize my position. I absolutely acknowledge the intellectual rigor of McLarty's critique regarding the outdated model of Social Security. The 35-year average is, well, demonstrably punitive to the modern career path. That's clear.
However, I believe the path forward requires a more nuanced approach. We really must question whether the specific proprietary engine-building strategy proposed, the explicit reliance on licensed IP, specialized vaults, trademarked assets, the whole package, is truly a necessary or accessible replacement strategy for basic financial security across all the demographics penalized by the current system. While ownership is undoubtedly paramount, mandating these specialized entrepreneurial systems might inadvertently create a new kind of unreachable class divide.
And I'll summarize my position by asserting that the structure of Social Security is fundamentally obsolete. It systematically penalizes the modern worker through the imposition of those zero-value years. Given this rigged game, as the material calls it, waiting for reform or trying to plan around a guaranteed insufficiency, well, it's just not a viable option anymore. The only path forward, the only logical path, is a proactive pivot toward building personal financial engines. This means focusing on asset creation, leveraging intangible property effectively, and generating controlled cash flow now, perhaps following the models demonstrated by the owner of the material, de-investment enterprise. Control, fundamentally, must be seized from the flawed institutional structure.
Ultimately, Devin McLarty's work, I think we can agree, successfully forces us to confront this fundamental tension between relying on existing institutional structures, however flawed, and the potentially radical but perhaps necessary pursuit of independent financial self-sovereignty in what is clearly a rapidly evolving economic landscape.
It absolutely challenges foundational assumptions about wealth building and demands that every individual reassess their reliance on long-term government promises versus the potential of immediate proactive ownership. There's certainly a lot to think about there.